I now look to Avril Haines to continue the case for the opposition.
Mr. President, officers of the Oxford Union, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for allowing me to speak here today. It is not a regular event for me to be painted as the representative of the Trump administration. I would reject that option. With a Canadian and a French socialist, I think we don't really make the right team. But I argue today against the proposition that we sacrificed our liberty for a false promise of security, because I fundamentally reject the framing of the opposition, of the proposition. The proposition is focused on the wrong question, and more importantly, perpetuates a fraudulent narrative regarding counterterrorism policy that undermines our efforts to protect liberty and security by obscuring the public conversation that really is needed. The motion suggests that our national security professionals have falsely promised us security in convincing us to accept constraints on our liberty. And having pulled the wool over our eyes, we have sacrificed our liberty, but are not secure. And such a caricature of the situation is not only inaccurate, it is damaging. I'll therefore start with 4 reasons why the motion is fundamentally flawed. First, while we can argue over whether we have sacrificed too much liberty in certain specific scenarios, particularly in the face of terrorism, certainly we have not sacrificed our liberty in its entirety, as has already been demonstrated by my colleague. And few people would argue that a free society can remain free without surrendering some liberty for protection against threats. Second, the proposition refers to a false promise of security. Yet I know of no responsible government official that has in fact promised perfect security, even from terrorist attacks, quite the opposite. Yet this framing suggests that is what we can and should be asking for, and in fact many demand as much in the aftermath of an attack. Third, and most importantly, the proposition implies that if the promise of perfect security were not false but true, it would be worth sacrificing our liberty. It is only because the promise is false that there's an objection to be had, and I vehemently disagree with that. Being free means being free to take risks. I'm not willing to sacrifice all or even most of my liberty, even if it meant I would be perfectly secure, and I don't think any of us should. Finally, the proposition sets up liberty and security, as has been made clear by Anthony, as 2 values constantly in tension with one another, which is far too simplistic of a frame that obscures the important ways in which these 2 values can in fact reinforce each other. An enhancement of one does not always come at the expense of the other. In fact, in many respects, these 2 values rely, at least in part, on the existence of the other. One cannot talk meaningfully about liberty in the absence of certain basic conditions of security. And if you focus on stripping the liberties in a society of a particular group perceived as somehow linked to those who pose a threat, you will inevitably exacerbate, if not create, a national security threat. For these reasons, I ask you to reject the proposition in favor of a serious discussion that has a chance of improving our collective approach to terrorism. A vote for the proposition puts you with those who falsely see counterterrorism policy as an enormous balancing act between security and liberty, that if accomplished correctly, ultimately can lead to a victory against the terrorists. Ironically, this is the frame used by terrorists. They want us to strip our societies of so much liberty that we do their work for them. Of course, there are, at times, certain trade-offs to be made between liberty and security. But here is the much more interesting and difficult question. Why is it so challenging for our leadership and our institutions to manage these questions and reach rational decisions on counterterrorism that protect the fundamental values on which our governments are founded? I'll devote the remainder of my time to this more foundational question. In my view, the public debate on these issues is a critical failure. While each of us individually are likely to come to different conclusions regarding the degree to which we may be willing to accept constraints on our behavior or what are perceived to be intrusions on liberty to achieve greater security, I suspect we are all dissatisfied on these matters with the way society reacts to attacks, the substance of the debate on these questions, and some of the decisions that are made. The faulty framing of the proposition is a product of what is wrong with the current public conversation on these questions. Terrorism is not going away. We will keep seeing violent extremism ideologies capture individuals who are capable, particularly in today's technologically advanced world, of engaging in terrorist attacks. If we continue to approach the issue as we have been, without breaking the cycle of fear and myths, we may make it impossible to preserve a society in which everyone has the opportunity to pursue life, liberty, and happiness in relative security. Let us agree on 5 propositions. First, terrorism is real and must be addressed. Since 9/11, the United States has been largely safe from the kind of catastrophic international terrorism we saw on that day. But over the last 10 years, we have also seen terrorist attacks around the world reach new levels. With the rise of ISIL, we have seen more attacks in the West, and the threat from homegrown and lone offender, or so-called lone wolf terrorism, has increased. Second, the United States, as well as our allies and partners, have invested an extraordinary amount of resources and time into countering such threats. Thanks to the incredibly hard work of national security professionals around the world, including in the United States, we have diminished the threat of international terrorism in our country. Third, Americans fear terrorism to an extent that is out of proportion with the threat, particularly in light of the relative success of our security services to mitigate the threat. Although Americans are over 1,000 times more likely to be shot by a criminal than killed by a terrorist, approximately 80% of American adults, according to a relatively recent Gallup poll, still consider international terrorism the most critical threat to their nation. This is, in fact, also out of line with the fact that in the United States, domestic terrorism is an even greater problem than international terrorism. Fourth, terrorists feed on and build such fear. This is the main purpose of their attacks. As Al-Qaeda noted in an issue of Inspire when instructing their followers to derail trains, quote, "It is time we instill fear and make them impose strict measures to trains as they did with their air transportation." They seek to change and influence the behavior of societies through their attacks. They are trying to sow fear in an effort to disrupt our way of life. Fifth, the greatest damage caused by terrorism is the reaction it produces in our societies. The fear that it creates among the population, the disruption that follows, and the subsequent demands for perfect security from the government. This reaction and demand for security leads governments and politicians to pursue resources, policies, measures that can go too far at times, policies that can undermine our values, our happiness, and which over the long run even undermine our security. For example, the adoption of waterboarding in interrogations, a technique that was fundamentally inconsistent with our values and one that ultimately, in my view, undermined our security rather than enhancing it. If you accept these propositions, I think this is what we must do. We must address the fear if we want to be effective in addressing terrorism and simultaneously take measures that to the greatest extent preserve our liberty. We must address the fear that our citizens feel and help them to overcome that fear. Second, leaders need to support resilience, push forward with daily life as an example to others, and acknowledge that it is not possible to fully secure our open societies, prevent all attacks by the alienated or disturbed, or defeat violent Islamic extremism without addressing the root causes of such extremism. Third, we must live our values and communicate them to the world, and in doing so, we must avoid consistently painting security as antithetical to liberty. Liberty and security are intimately linked and can be mutually reinforcing, but to understand that, you frequently need to take a long view. For example, a state that does not address violence against women is constraining their liberty. And if you focus on stripping the liberty of a community of individuals within your society who are linked by religion or culture to those who are actually engaging in terrorist attacks, you can turn that community against the state, rather than empowering them and listing them in your cause, which would enhance your security. I will say this. To handle this challenge properly, we need leaders who are not patronizing but patient, who recognize that fear is an enormous motivator, who understand that fear is unlikely to be effectively countered solely with facts and figures, but requires constant, credible communication that helps people understand the nature of the threat and what they do to protect their community. Members of the Oxford Union, I believe you're such leaders. And if you agree, and if you don't want to disappoint those people before you have talked about how it is that we should approach these issues in rational ways, you should oppose this proposition and the fraud it's perpetrating. A vote no is a vote in favor of a better, more constructive conversation about how to counter terrorism. This is not a fight between liberty and security. Thank you for listening.